Great. Thanks so much, Liam. Good afternoon, everyone. As Liam said, I'm a former graduate of, I did my undergraduate studies at Mary Immaculate, so it's really nice to be invited back. Liam taught me, as he said, many moons ago, but hopefully not as many as he's suggesting. It's wonderful to be here today alongside Jamie and Tanya to talk about cultures of learning in the English convents in exile. Now, we've just heard Jamie discuss the much more well-known English Benedictines who could count, I think, maybe 6 or 7 convents throughout France and Flanders. The order which I'm going to discuss, however, was a much smaller group, the English Canonesses of the Holy Sepulchre. It's much less well-known too, the English branch of the order only having one community, and that was founded in Liège in 1642. Yet in spite of their numerical modesty, their history is a fascinating one, especially in the late 18th century, when they booked trends in recruitment patterns that many communities were experiencing. So at a time when many English convents, but not only English convents, but indeed many convents and religious houses across Catholic Europe were affected by declining vocation patterns and issues relating to internal cohesion, the convent at Liège experienced what can only be described as a vocations boom that lasted from about 1760 up until their relocation to England in 1794. Now, much of this success, in my opinion, can be attributed to their cultures of learning that had evolved there in the second half of the century. This was manifest most visibly in a thriving school that they ran, but also through a culture of dialogue and openness that pervaded the religious community. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about the school that they ran and the type of educational culture that they offered, but also the ways in which cultures of learning and scholarship were promoted within the community itself. And finally, how these cultures benefited from a wider ethos of openness and dialogue that was brought to fruition by, amongst other things, an ethos of cosmopolitanism, intercommunity dialogue, and cooperation. But before I go any further, I just want to give a very brief overview of the community's history for context. So the English branch of the order was founded in 1642 in Liège by a young woman from Middlesex named Susan Hawley. The community relocated from its home on the Creuse in 1656 to the former house of a suppressed male order called the Frères Coquins on the Faubourg d'Avril, where they remained until their migration to England in 1794. Now, as canonesses, they were not strictly nuns, yet they were not apostolic or active sisters either. They straddled the contemplative and active worlds, but were an enclosed community. This middle way, if you will, afforded them a certain amount of freedom to move between the contemplative world and to embrace the spheres of education and learning in new ways that push the accepted gender boundaries. What I'd like to talk today are cultures of learning in the period, I suppose, 1750 up to 1794, when the canonesses fled the revolution in Liège and returned to England. Now, to put what took place in context, I just want to start by offering some profession figures, and to do that, I will just share my screen. Hopefully that works.
Yeah, we can see that, Cormac.
Great, thanks, Liam. So as you can see from this slide, this community experienced a substantial decline in entrance in the 1730s, which was sustained in the 1740s and the 1750s. Now this, if I had shown you figures from the late 17th century, that this decline would become more evident. In the 1760s and 1770s, however, there was an explosion in vocations, as you can see, starting in the 1760s, but then really coming to fruition in the 1770s. Now, this was so much so that by the time the convent of the migration to England in 1794, the Canonesses were the largest of all the English convents in exile. Now, pinpointing the reasons behind this sea change is, of course, not an exact science, but it's possible to see the actions in the influence of one particular individual, the actions of one particular individual, and that individual's name was Christina Dennett, who you will see here. Christina was born to a Catholic mother and Protestant father in rural Lancashire, and she followed a similar path to many young Catholic women from England who sought to join a convent, entering Liège at the age of 17. And it's with her entry that we're able to identify one of the tangible events that affected the cultures of learning at the convent. In actual fact, Dennett was probably not the instigator of this particular act, with the credit possibly going to the then prioress, Mother Mary Zevria Withenbury. During her novitiate, Dennett was sent to spend 6 months with an Ursuline convent. Now, why was this act particularly significant, you might ask? The Ursulines were founded as a non-cloistered community with an expressly apostolic charism. They later became synonymous with education, especially in France. Now, Laurence Luxterret suggests that in their efforts to reach out to the female half of the population and to strengthen the links of the Catholic Church with women of all backgrounds, they would have to adopt a versatile and comprehensive outlook, not only on whom they resolved to teach, but also on their curriculum and on the methods they would adopt to be pedagogically effective. Now, Dennett's sojourn with the Ursulines must have had a major impact on future changes at Liège, for it's recorded as an important juncture in many of the community's written histories. Whether or not it was the first example of a young sister being sent to experience religious life with the Ursulines, we don't know, but it certainly wasn't the last, as we'll see a little bit later on. In a biography of her life, we're told that Dennett was sent to the Ursulines to learn music, but hadn't an ear for it, though she eventually mastered the harpsichord, which allowed her later to become an accomplished organist. But apart from this, we're left to speculate as to what the young novice picked up during her time with the Ursulines that left such a lasting impression. Now, it seems likely that what Dennett learned was put to use in the field of education, with the Canonesses being relatively well known for their reformation and modernisation of the school at Liège, which is largely credited to Dennett. She oversaw the creation of a purpose-built school in the modern sense, with its own buildings, school registers, which often go into great detail on things like parental recommendations, as well, significantly, as well as a modern defined secular curriculum. This was a departure of what had gone before it, and what was then on offer in a number of the English convents. So traditionally, schools, if you could even call them that, in the convents, catered for much smaller numbers of girls, and I suppose they were more devotional in outlook. What was offered at Liège from the 1760s onwards was broad, but also pushed the boundaries as to what was traditionally deemed acceptable for females. A sign of their ambitions was that in the early 1770s they published a curriculum in the French language significantly. The curriculum said the school offered things like bookkeeping, Italian and French, geography and the natural sciences, art, painting, music, amongst other things. Learning was promoted through public displays, while some secular staff were even employed to carry out teaching of certain subjects. The surviving sources suggest that what was offered was very much tailored to meet the needs of the individual too, and it was not simply a case of one size fits all. Now, I don't want to dwell on the educational offering in too much detail, but rather I'd like to look at the cultures of learning that were behind some of the major changes that took place in the convent in the second half of the 18th century. As I mentioned earlier, the Canonesses bucked the vocations trend, attracting large numbers of recruits at a time when other communities were experiencing difficulties. Now, this graph illustrates the gradual downward trend in vocations that the English convents were experiencing in the 18th century. Liège had, of course, a different experience, as I've just pointed out. Whatever was taking place at the convent obviously was proving attractive to the young women drawn to the community. Now, there was an undeniable embracing of what you might call certain Enlightenment ideals. I've talked about in other papers that I've given recently, the ways in which the school prospered, drawing a truly international mix of pupils, was, I would suggest, a draw to young women. However, lest we be tempted to see what was taking place as somehow a diluting of the faith dimension and a move towards a community life that had an increasingly secular favour, what actually occurred at Liège was quite the opposite. Dennett was an advocate of a modern educational offering for girls that was both radical and far-reaching. Yet under her leadership, so Dennett actually goes on, she's prioress, made prioress in 1770. Under her leadership, she spearheaded what can be called a contemplative and spiritual revival within the community. This revival appears to have stemmed from a vision that she had of the Sacred Heart in 1766, which was outlined in this particular document entitled An Intellectual Vision of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. As I say, this unquestionably had a profound effect on her and the changes that she oversaw. Yet I think that Dennett and the other reformers at Liège were forced to look outside of the community for their inspiration for these changes. The community was not, to me at least, an inward-looking, it was not responsible for an inward-looking reformation, as one can see especially from the community's library. So if you look at the library, you begin to see books like the following. And this is La vie de la Mère Marie de l'Incarnation. This appears in the 1760s. Now, Marie of the Incarnation was a 17th century Ursuline nun, credited with founding the first school for girls in the New World, in what was known as New France, in an area that straddled modern-day Canada and the USA. Mother Marie became famous for her work with native girls and for the system of education that she promoted, which had many similarities, I think, with what was on offer in Liège from the 1760s. The library also contained numerous books dedicated to reform movements within monastic houses, such as the famous Abbey of La Trappe. And then in the 1780s, you find interesting examples. Recently, I found a handwritten edition of the life of Lucy Knatchbull, the famous 17th century abbess of the Benedictine convent at Ghent. So even in this what you might call late period, you see them looking back to the 17th century outside of their own order for inspiration for the changes that they were putting into practice. Devotion to and promotion of the Sacred Heart, though, appears to have been a major concern for Christina. The Benefactor's book shows records of things like the installation of statues and even of an altar to this particular devotion. The book collection reflects this too. This particular edition we have here dates from 1765. And then on a recent trip to the Jesuit archives in London that I made, I came across, I think what's called a spiritual commonplace book, Exercises in Honor of the Sacred Heart, which is written in Christina Dennett's own hand. I think what we have here is a culture of spiritual learning, Dennett's own understanding and knowledge of the devotion of to the Sacred Heart growing all the time. Now, earlier I mentioned that inter-community collaboration existed, and it is to do with this promotion of this devotion that we have a prime example. Now, at Liège, the Canonesses had a very close relationship with the Society of Jesus, English Jesuits acting as the community's confessors throughout their time in Liège. Dennett formed a particularly close bond with one of these men, Father John Howard. Howard also was a native of Lancashire, and he was, I think, about 10 years Dennett's senior in age. Howard was so, and you can see throughout the history that both figures collaborate quite closely. And Howard was so impressed by the changes in curriculum that Dennett had made at the convent school that it even inspired him to alter the curriculum their own curriculum, and that was an offer at the English Academy in Liège. So this is a very rare example of female religious education influencing the male religious offering. Now the pair then later went on to collaborate, writing prayers and devout instructions for different times of the day, which was printed in 1776 and later reprinted in the 1790s. Now I could say more on this particular topic, but time does not permit it. For now, I'd like to return and say a little bit about how the community's outward focus impact on their life. To some, this suggestion that an enclosed community of nuns had such a focus might seem odd or even questionable, but that is exactly what they had. You'll recall earlier that I mentioned Christina Dennett's time with an Ursuline convent. Now, as I said then, we can't really be sure if Christina was the first novice to be sent from their own convent to spend time with the Ursulines, but she certainly wasn't the last. Here is an example from the community's account books from 1766, which contains the following verse. Received from the Ursulines when the pensioners came back, having advanced their pensions. Now, in a few other places, we find bills for named sisters who had been sent to stay at unspecified Ursuline convents. Unfortunately, the nature of the arrangement is not clear, but it appears that some sort of cooperation between both groups was existing. The exchange, which appears always to have taken place during young sisters' novitiates, presumably deliberately so, may have been conceived as, if you like, an intended exposure to the life of a community which the Canonesses valued, one which remains unfortunately largely a hidden culture of learning. So unfortunately, sources really don't permit us to say a huge amount about this exchange between the Canonesses and the Ursulines, but as I say, there's quite a number of references there to young sisters during their novitiate being sent from the convent in Liège to spend time with the Ursulines. The interaction with the outside world seems to have played a very significant role in the history of the community from its foundation, but especially so after the 1750s. For example, the community had always welcomed visitors, many of whom were what were called retired dames. Of course, this was not unusual. Convents across Catholic Europe did likewise. But as well as women and priests, the convent at Liège was home to many male visitors, some of whom stayed only for a few days, whilst others stayed for much longer periods of time. Many were English, some were Irish, whilst a number came from America, and some even from as far as the Caribbean. Many of the guests who stayed at the convent had daughters at the school, or indeed even they had daughters who were members of the community itself. Some were, it would seem, conducting business, while some were on the holidays, yet further taking that most ubiquitous of enlightened trips, the Grand Tour. Now again, time doesn't really permit me to go into any great detail regarding the visitors themselves. However, we might ask ourselves the question, could their presence be seen as an additional culture of learning? One might make the argument that guests were accepted as a matter of fiscal prudence. However, I think it would be actually foolish to discount the impact that visitors had on the community. An English Protestant who visited the convent in the very early 1700s wrote in his diary, "This afternoon I went to the English nuns, which are called the Sepulchrines. I was entertained there with music, where one of them sang, another played on the lute, and a Jesuit on the bass viol, all of which was very well performed." And the Protestant visitor presumably was drawn to the convent by a sense of curiosity, and presumably learned much. But this must have been a two-way learning process too. If one looks at the account books and book of boarders and pensioners, which we have here, we see that many of these people were quite regular guests at the convent. A prime example being John Carroll. Now, John Carroll became the first archbishop, first Catholic bishop in the United States, the Bishop of Baltimore. Many of the visitors were proponents of the liberal Catholic cause espoused by the Cisalpine Club in the 1790s, many of whom were Irish. I've come across the Earl of Fingal staying there, Viscount Taft just being two examples. Again, sources recalling the interactions between guests and the community are unfortunately all too rare. But it seems unlikely to me at least, especially considering the attitudes towards education and openness that the community expressed, that some of their guests' views, it would be unlikely if some of their guests' views were not absorbed, and of course, again, vice versa. I'll finish by broadening this out, by moving out of the convent itself, continuing with the theme of visitors and the dialogue that they engaged in, both with the community and the school pupils, as I said, many of whom were daughters to these visitors. Now, some years ago, I conducted a little research on the town of Spa in Belgium. As you'll know, Spa was renowned as a centre of cosmopolitanism and enlightened thought. Such was its renown that every year from the 1760s, lists were published of prominent visitors who holidayed there. Now, upon cross-referencing these published lists with the boarders' accounts, I found it was not uncommon for visitors to stay at the convent before journeying to Spa, and also vice versa. Now, really interestingly, I found a number of examples of nuns having visited Spa with their families just before they were received as novices into the convent. So what we get here is this very curious fusion of enclosed religious life sitting alongside the most cosmopolitan worldly setting, where the latest philosophical developments were discussed in a multi-creed environment. Now, I hope what I've done today is to suggest some cultures of learning that may not necessarily spring to mind at first thought. Yet, in my opinion, these traits of openness and dialogue were cultures of learning. And a step on from this, these cultures of learning had a very tangible, and in the case of the Canonesses, transformative effect on their history. Thank you.